You're listening to Theory from the Closet, recorded in beautiful Madison, Wisconsin. Theory from the Closet is a role-playing game show that covers theory, design, and the issues that arise through play. Okay, I tried really hard with this one, because I was so excited about the content, but it's beyond my ability to really get it cleaned up well. So I think the content's worth listening to. This was recorded on a Amtrak train coming into Gen Con 2010, and I did what I could, but it was a noisy situation. If there's any editing masters out there that'd like to give it a try, let me know, and I can try to get the WAV file to you. It's about 1 gigabyte. Anyways, without further ado, talk to Major Wesely. Okay, welcome to Theory from the Closet. I'm Clyde, and today I have David Wesely, also known as Major Wesely. And I'm going to ask him a bunch of questions. So, what I'd like to do is start with, I'd like to start before Braunstein. That's going to be hard for me. And
you're from Wisconsin, a good German state.
And I've got a lot of good German family too, but I still can't do it. Let's start. I'd like to know what war games were like before you made that. Here, let me pass this over.
All right. Well, what war games like before Braunstein? Yeah. Oh, well, that can go back a long ways. I got into wargaming in 1958 when I came across a copy of Avalon Hill's Gettysburg game, which was a cardboard war game, map board game, about the Battle of Gettysburg, obviously. I'd gone down to the local bookstore to buy a copy of Tarzan and the Ant-Men or something. I was a big Tarzan fan, and I was buying one at a time in hardbound, and I was 13 at the time. And I saw this cool-looking game with a cannon on the cover, and I opened it up and read it, and it had this 16-page rule manual that just seemed just the most sophisticated thing in the world to me. And so I decided to buy that instead of the Tarzan book. And then I found a few friends I could talk into trying to figure out the rules. And we played this board game for a while. And then Avalon Hill had a couple of other titles, and I bought those, and we played those. And, when we were 13, we didn't have a lot of real historical knowledge. We kind of knew there was a civil war and which side won. And that it was fought 100 years roughly before that. It was 1860, and I'm doing this in 1958. And most of the gaming at the time that I was involved in consisted of playing the board games you get from Avalon Hill. There were a couple of other things that were on the market in those days from the more established game companies. Risk, for example, came out in that period. And trying to what else there was. It was American Heritage Games brought out a couple of very badly designed games about the American Civil War and the War of 1812 and stuff, and we all tried them and just shook our heads and said, this is really junk, So most of the gaming was up to that point, from like 58 until 63, when I'm going to graduate from high school. We moved from Rochester, Minnesota, which is a small town. There weren't many people to play games with, up to the Twin Cities. And most gamers at that time were people who had at some point found an Avalon Hill game and who were subscribing to the Avalon Hill Journal, the company magazine, and who were reading the Opponents Wanted column in the back to try to find somebody else who'd play the games because it was a pretty esoteric thing to do. I got the kids in the chess club in my high school playing the games. And you were always trying to find another opponent for a game, right? And most people, they weren't really that turned on by them, but you find a certain group of people who were interested. That was kind of cool. And of course, as you get older and you learn more about history, you start reading books about the Civil War or whatever. So there's a little more tie into it. Then in the about the same time, from around 1960, a book came out, I think it was called How to Play War Games with Miniatures, by one of the editors from, I can't remember now, a big magazine named Joseph Morse was the author's name, and he was an editor with Time or Newsweek, one of those. And there was a one-page issue, one-page mention of him and his guys playing games with lead soldiers in the magazine. It caught our eyes. And he read the book, and it told you how to, hand paint lead miniatures from various historical periods and play battles with them. And there were people out there that we'd never heard of who were our father's age, who'd been playing games, fairly serious war games with lead miniatures since, well, some people say since H.G. Wells wrote his book Little Wars back around World War I. In my library at St. Paul, Minnesota, I found a book published in the 1920s called Sham Battle, which was an attempt to be a little bit more sophisticated about your gaming than H.G. Wells was. But there was a small group of guys who'd been playing games and writing rules. Fletcher Pratt, the noted science fiction author, had been doing naval war games with model ships in, I think, Chicago area in the 1940. New York, was it? Okay. So all this had been going on, but when you're a teenager, you don't know much about stuff, right?
Right.
And so gradually we're finding all these stuff going on out there, right? So we started buying lead miniatures from a manufacturer in California named Jack Scrooby, and just like everybody else in these hobbies, they had fanzines. They were dirt cheap, $1 a year subscription for your 6-page a month fanzine, or 6-page a quarter maybe fanzine, and it would have a write-in thing reporting on the glorious achievements of your whole battalion of hand-painted grenadiers in the last battle, and also it would have advertisements for, I'm stuck in Bismarck, North Dakota, I can't find anybody. Is there anybody within 200 miles of me who wants to play war games?
So were do you think the magazines were, the retellings you were talking about were kind of an attempt to add story to what was going on a little bit? Or?
Well, it was. There was a certain amount of imagination in doing these games. I mean, what do you actually do? You're pushing pieces of lead around on the table and you're rolling dice against the probability table. All right, so you kind of want to imbue this with some emotional and historical context. And to agree that you're writing your own rules and you're trying to model history, you'd like them to work out sort of the way that battles really did in the period you're modeling.
Right.
But for a lot of people, and I wasn't real sophisticated at the time, but I could figure this out. A lot of people, it was the social atmosphere of the game. Just there are a lot of people who play bridge because they desperately want to win and beat everybody. There are people who play poker because they want to make a lot of money. But there are most people who do that because it gives you an excuse to sit around and do something with the other guys and drink some beer while you're doing it. And you don't make a lot or lose a lot of money, well, unless you have a gambling addiction problem. But you just do it as a social activity, and that was pretty evident to me even then. There were a lot of people who were into gaming, didn't really care about sophistication rules, just wanted an excuse to get together. And there was, because the Civil War centennial had just come and gone, there was a lot of interest in that as a historical period, and they thought it was cool. So Civil War was one of the biggest things you were painting up little armies to do, and the Napoleonic Wars were another big era of history.
What scale was that?
Most of the people that we were with were buying the stuff from Jack Scrooby, and Scrooby made figures in several different scales with different purposes. He made really large figures for people who wanted to paint up an officer of the Imperial Guard in 1811 uniform with every last little detail on it, big artistic figures, right? And then he made more modest ones, about 54 millimeters high, which were the size of the old Britain's Company lead soldiers.
Wow,
and those were, again, really there for people who wanted to paint up, put a lot of time in painting each model. Then he made 30 millimeter figures, which were the sort of the standard size from Europe at that time. Though we didn't quite understand that's why he had that size, but that's what had been popularized around the turn of the century for toy soldiers in Europe. And then 30 millimeters, like an inch and a quarter. And then he made 20 millimeter figures, and he said that they're not really great detail on them, but if you want to make war games armies and not spend your whole life painting, a 20 millimeter figure can be painted pretty fast, right? So we were all buying Jack Scrooby's 20 millimeter figures and playing in that scale. The other source was the Airfix company. Airfix, the British plastic model company, had while I was in high school, and maybe a little before that, started bringing out little 1/72, which would be 25 millimeter tall World War II infantrymen sets, and Germans and British and Americans and so on from World War II, and American Civil War figures, and a whole line of other stuff. And they were dirt cheap. They were made out of safe flexi plastic that children won't get poisoned when they chew on. But unfortunately, which you can spend about 10 minutes painting because the paint will flake right back off it again the first time somebody looks at it cross-eyed. So we had a love-hate relationship with the Airfix figures. They were dirt cheap. You can get 50 of them for like 98 cents, as opposed to 10 cents a piece for the lead ones. And you could and 10 cents was pretty cheap in the lead figure market too. I mean, a 20 millimeter was at 10 cents a piece, or 15 cents per cavalryman. That was like a bargain compared to what you could pay. So anyhow, we had this mix of available figures. Everybody was sort of interested in various historical periods, but the three dominant ones, the American Civil War and World War II and the Napoleonic era, and people were making figures to go with those. And there were groups, again, of people who were older than we were. In Ohio, I think, there was a company that was making a lot of lead miniatures for the Napoleonic, or is that what they did? There were guys in Chicago doing this who were old enough to be my dad. You know, it was this sort of a group. But it was a rapidly growing hobby. As for what the gaming was like, well, now we get into social things. Like I said, a lot of people were doing it just for the socializing aspect. They didn't really care a lot about the rules. Others of us were really crazy about history, wanted to get every last detail right. And so we were constantly trying to come up with better rules. And there were no well-established, standardized rules. The Avalon Hill games, well, you played according to the rules that were in the box. Right? But from the miniatures battles, there were a lot of quickie knockoff sets of rules from people, but if you were historically oriented the way I was, you go, that's completely wrong. You can't really fire 4 times as far with a rifle as with a musket, and the cannons ought to be able to shoot further, and so you were constantly fiddling with the rules. Also, the rules had loopholes in a way. Nobody's business. They were not well crafted. So you were constantly finding dumb things in the rules, exceptions, and then you got the new group of people in there who were the rules lawyers who would argue every last little detail all night long in an effort to not be defeated. So a group like ours, which by 65 had probably grown to about 30 people who were gaming. I'm kind of pulling that out of my, let me think. No, actually, it's a little too early. 65 was the first time another thing happened. I got a letter from somebody who had been buying lead figures from Jack Scrooby, and had written back to Jack and said, give me a list of all your customers in Minnesota so I can try to get them all together. And so I was contacted by this, again, like 55-year-old guy who was trying to organize a group. Right. And so 7 of us, wow, 7 got together at his house. And I had maybe 2 other people I knew who played board war games and were messing around with Airfix figures with me. And about half the people in the group were interested in painting collectible figures and hand-building obscure aircraft that you couldn't buy plastic kits for than they were doing war games. But we got together, and from that group, we started then attracting more bodies. And so from April of 65, when we got together for that first meeting, to 68, we had expanded by leaps and bounds, and we brought in a lot of people we found who were advertising, looking for opponents in the general without knowing there were people in town like us who would read the ad and get in touch with them. And so we were gathering the group together, and we were doing battles, and several of us were trying to write a better set of rules than the ones that we've been able to find. I almost said on the internet, which didn't exist back then. You found out these things existed because they were listed in ads for them in the cheap fanzines, right? And you'd write off a letter to someplace, send them $10, and they'd send you 25 mimeograph pages of rules, and you'd play them 2 games. You'd go, but these things really stink, or whatever, right? And then you try to write your own. So we were going through all that stuff, and we were fighting ever more ambitious and complicated battles. And then things just sort of started building. We got into, socially within the group, there were various always very estranged between the people who just wanted to play and didn't want to argue, and the people who wanted to argue, they loved to argue, and the ones who absolutely had to win it and the ones who didn't care much, right? And there was just social interaction things going on there that, now that I'm 65, I look back and I go, yeah, well, we're a bunch of teenagers. What the hell? It's stupid. I mean, the older guys within our group who were playing the games were 25, 26, right? A bunch of dumb kids. I says now, right? At the time, they were the old guys. All right, and then there were guys like me who by 60, 65, I'm 20, and I'm sort of the transition point between the small group of older guys and the much larger group of high school age kids that have keep joining. We keep recruiting these kids at like average recruiting age is like about 15 or 16, right? And we were working trying to come up with good rules, and we had a lot of conflicts going on and battles that would never end, because as soon as one or another of the guys was losing, he'd just start an argument about the rules, and it would go on until 2 o'clock in the morning. We'd throw in the towel. And I said, well, we got to do something about this. Now, one of the things that had brought us together was a book published in 1880, Strategos, the American Game of War, which is a 340-page manual for playing war games that was intended by its author as the training manual for war games for the U.S. Army.
That's the one by Charles Adele Lewis. Totten.
Right.
Okay.
And we got together because one of our guys that was in our group was a student at the U of M and had looked in the card catalog there and found under war games there was actually like an entry. And there it was, right? Yeah, that was what happened.
Okay.
You look for, under war games in those days, you would come up with an anti-war movie called The War Game, or you would find a thing about the mathematical principles of gaming theory. And if you have the University of Minnesota, you actually had a book about wargaming, right? Okay. So it was a really limited group. So he found it. He'd gone down the stacks. He pulled it out. In those days, when you checked out a book at the U of M, there was a card in the back, and you signed your name on it and handed the card in so they'd know who had the book, right? Well, he looked, and there were people's names on it with the dates, right? So he didn't bother to look for the people who'd signed it out in 1905, but he had 4 people who'd signed it out in the last 4 years. So he contacted them, and that brought 3 new faces into the group we hadn't met before, students at the U. And all of us who'd never heard the book before, of course, had to quick take a look at it. And most people, about 342 pages. The biggest thing from Avalon Hill is 16 pages long. This is insane, right?
Right.
And most of our handwritten attempts would run 20 pages, right? But we looked at it, and I said, this is unbelievable. I mean, the guy's got page after page of work in here. He analyzed the results of these different battles to come up with his tables, and this has got to just be like the bee's knees for ultimate in sophistication. And by 1880 standards, it certainly was. Right? He had really beat himself silly over the statistics in the American Civil War and weapons trials in 1870s and everything else to make these rules. But it was so monstrously complicated, we all agreed we could never manage to play those games.
Right.
Well, now a year or so has passed from our first having seen those, and there are these stresses that are kind of really making the gaming just too annoying and unsatisfying of an evening. And I said, okay, we're going to go back and look at this again. The cornerstone of these rules was that there would be a referee who takes care of making sure the game keeps running, and you can't stand around and argue with him. He says...
Okay, wait. Just before you get to it, I want to make sure I see numbers on this.
Do you see numbers?
Okay, good.
Okay.
Before you get to that part, I wanted to make sure. Sorry.
Well, the cornerstone of the Strategos, you have a referee. I mean, he's probably a colonel, but in any case, right, it's a military setting. He says, goes, you don't argue with him, right? And even if you don't actually he doesn't actually outrank everybody, he's still empowered to make the decisions and keep things going and make no argument. Okay, well, write that. We'll talk about it next week, right? And go on, right? So I said, okay, let's try to do this. Let's try to have a referee. That seemed like a good idea. So we did a couple of games with that, and we blundered around on the thing about, can the referee play in the game? No, obviously he can't be on either side in the battle because he'd be biased.
Right.
And darn, I refereed last week. I have to referee all the time. When do I get to play? And various things. And let's not have a referee. Let's just vote on it. Whereupon the guys who like to argue will campaign for the rest of the evening instead, right? And so the guys who really wanted to do nothing but argue just wouldn't go along with the idea of being a referee that wasn't them, and they didn't want to be the referee because they didn't get to play.
Because they didn't get to win.
Right. The referee can't win, and the referee doesn't get to play, and so it's no fun to being told things by some other guy, and so they packed up in a huff and marched off, which was, frankly, good riddance. But we then got a group that was amenable to the notion of having a referee running the games. Now the problem is, who wants to be the referee? Well, a couple of things came out of that. One of the things that Totten had said was that in addition to deciding all these questions and helping everybody do the tedious computations, and they fiendishly computations. Remember, no handheld calculators then, right? So he has these tables, and if your battery of artillery is firing shrapnel at 2,000 yards at a line of enemy cavalry that are approaching in skirmish order, executing a wheel to the left, you have about 9 different multipliers you look up and apply to the circumstances to come out exactly how many casualties get inflicted, up to the point when you have to check their morale according to table 5 with 2d6, and then after you come back from that result, then you determine whether they continue the maneuver as intended or they now change, and according to what they then do, you inflict more casualties at another rate, Well, this is pretty tedious computation, but we all thought that was kind of fun, at least those of us who could do lots of and lots of multiplications in our head or use a slide rule. And so we were just cruising along, and the people who just wanted the game would just kind of roll with it and just let us tell us how many guys that got killed, right? But one of the things that Totten said, I wandered off there. One of the things Totten said was that in addition to the mechanical running of the game, he also takes care of providing intelligence from civilians or other unforeseen decisions that will happen during the game, things that chance and so on play a part in warfare, and that the referee basically was empowered to create the scenario that you're going to be fighting. He plans out the battle. You don't always do historical battles, which you pretty well know what you're supposed to do if you've read the book, right? So he would come up with a scenario. He would say, here's what our circumstances are. Here's where you start here. These forces can come in as reinforcements, and your objective is to capture the bridge over this river, or whatever it is, right? He'd set it all up, and he would know all the things that you wouldn't know until you got there. Your objective is to capture that bridge over that river. Okay, fine, but it turns out that, once you check it out, you'll find out you can wade across the river because it's dry season. And things like that. And some of those are just drawn from what has happened in historical battles. People are madly defending some bridge, and it turns out you didn't have to fight over it because you could have waded right around it. Right? So the referee knows all this cool stuff. He invents a battle. He comes up with particularly cute battles with surprises and twists. Does this sort of sound like something?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Okay. And we had one great line that those of us who were in the gaming group back then we still enjoy, which is the phrase, "What do the Cossacks see on the road?" Somebody sent his Cossacks out sweeping off the board to a position from which they could check out the road that would be used by the enemy for reinforcements. And they go back there, and eventually a messenger comes back and it says they see nothing on the road. Ha! There's nobody coming that way, right? Mm-hmm. Sorry. The bad news is that a whimsical referee said there was nothing on the road. The rain had made the road so impassable that no one was traveling on the road. The enemy troops were all marching parallel to the road across the fields. Nothing is on the road, right? So, it's kind of cruel, but in any case. So things were going on like that. Now, so we're getting into these games where there's a referee who runs things. At that point, some of us found that the compensations of being the referee but knowing what's going on and having fun with the players offset the I never get to be a commander. Furthermore, if there were a few of us who liked that enough to do it all the time, or rather, you could always find a referee because one of about 4 of us would be willing to go do that. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the other guys would get to play as players periodically. You didn't always get stuck with being the permanent eternal referee. You traded that job off, but it was just a small circle of people who enjoyed the refereeing thing and had imagination to create useful battles. It wasn't just I guess we'll just have like a big hill in the middle and you're all going to fight over it. Yeah, right. So you came up with this. Now, of course, the years have gone by, and we all now understand how many people there are who can be competent dungeon masters and how many who can't, right? And that was presaged that, right? So we have a group, and we're playing these battles. We also were really fascinated by the notion of ever greater scope and scale. Now, among the 4 people who were reasonable referees, right, I was one. And another one was David Arneson, who is going to become famous later.
Right.
And so we're doing this stuff. Arneson is doing up games. He's now embarked upon a really ambitious program, and he's got a campaign going. Campaign in the period language, at least as used within Minnesota, was a campaign was a related series of battles. Some groups would just agree that they were going to do the battles of a real campaign, the 11 battles of the Asanza River in World War I or something. And the guys who win the most of them win the campaign. That would be one way. But most people, the feeling was, no, campaign is the grander scheme of things. You don't just have a set series of battles. You have the reason why the French are invading Italy in 1797. You have the Austrians' positions are here, and the French are here, and the various minor states are allied with them or not with them. And you're confronted by the strategic questions that Napoleon has in the 1797 campaign, rather than just, we're going to fight the Battle of Lodi Bridge and the Battle of Marengo. And so you wound up fighting battles in other towns, at other places you could cross the river, because people maneuvered differently.
Now, were they being set up so that they were based on the results of what had happened before too, or based on mainly on history?
Well, originally they were based on history, and then we branched out from that into, okay, we're going to take a step back. And we had the first great Napoleonic campaign, in which everybody got to be the head of one of the countries of Europe. And by this time, we're running, 30 people. Right? Everybody got to be the head of one of the countries in Europe, except a few countries that were really big got to have committees. England, for example, was a democracy anyhow, got like 5 players who had to kind of argue with each other about what they're going to do. And there were some factions. I mean, revolutionary France isn't really just a one-man show. But each of them got a budget. And several of the people in the group, Dave Arneson, who was a history major, and came up with these phenomenally great sources of stuff at the University of Minnesota Library to find out how much does it cost to build a warship in that period, and how many tons how much the crew, and what's the supplies, and all the other things,
what's
right?
What's it displace, and
right,
armaments,
and so you could give somebody a budget of £250,000 sterling. And, okay, it's up to you to outfit the Navy you think you want to have for this, right? And he'd build so many 74s and so many frigates, and,
right.
So we had these completely hypothetical armed forces being built up based on these big master price lists, and everybody would organize them, and then they'd negotiate with each other. And it was quite informative to see how much in that, in a monarchy period, how much history derives not from national interest in the kind of cosmic sense that we would think of today, but personal attitudes towards individual people.
Yes.
Right? And it's, there's a certain amount of not tongue-in-cheek, right? A certain amount of poking at the Kaiser in 1914 writing these cousin Nicky letters off to the Tsar of all the Russias. And it's a personal, just me and you make up our minds about whether to have this war or that kind of an approach. And it looks so insane, right? Because, of course, it failed. But it's not out of touch. It's just that the last vestige of the we royal guys run Europe, and we decide whether to go war with each other or not. It isn't the great German Drangnak Osten versus the Pan-Slavism that's going on here. It's how do you feel about me, right? So anyhow, he set the campaign up, and it ran for a fair period of time, and it's against that backdrop of that ongoing campaign where he's getting ever bigger sets of data coming in from everybody every week about the complicated decision making and everything. And he's now really got himself into the I'm the referee day in, day out, every single day, and never got to play a game situation. Now, that's one parallel strand of the move into role-playing games. I'll back up a little bit. My piece of it was that I had, in the kind of the lean days when there were a few people to play games with, I'd come across a book about the theory of games called The Complete Strategist, which you've probably written down somewhere.
Yes, I have.
I'd come across a book about conflict resolution called Conflict and Defense, which had all sorts of, it was heavy reading. Oh gosh, it was heavy reading, and I wasn't really crazy about it. I bought it because I thought it would be when we built wargaming. And it was about gaming, but it did express, it had some important ideas that I thought were cool. And of course I had some Strategos. So on the one hand, I have the referee mechanics from the Strategos games. On the other hand, I have this curiosity that's been piqued by the games theory book, which is a lot of fun, and which pointed out that you can have games in which I have like 5 different strategies I can pursue, and you have 4. And you can make up a matrix, and with the values as a consequence of I do this and you do that, here's what happens, and I assign a value to it. And when you can, if you can fill it in, and the author was very clear about this, if you can fill those numbers in, so you can really assign a numeric value of worth to you for each of the possible outcomes, then you can use mathematics to work out what the best strategy for either side is. In many cases, it turns out there's one best strategy for each side, that if they do anything else, the other side will hurt them more. And you'll wind up with what's called a saddle point, where you both I play strategy 4 and you play your strategy D, and we always do that over and over because anything else we do would hurt worse, right? But in a lot of cases, it's not that simple, and if I'm playing 4 and you're playing D, you can go, oh, well, I'm going to stop playing D now, I want to play B. And then I can go, well, he's probably going to play B next, so I'll play, and you get a cute method, mathematical methods for picking out the best ratio of strategies. That said, that's a bit of a mathematical abstraction, but it did give you ways of analyzing game options and life decisions and things that proved to be very handy. One of the things he had in there was a comment that, now that's great, I spent the whole book describing how I've got 2 sides, it's a 2-player game. But in the real world, there are 2 things that we haven't touched on at the last chapter, and he just waves his hands and says, and mathematicians haven't done a very good job of solving these. The one of them is the N-player game, where there's not just 2 sides.
Where N's more than 2.
N is more than 2.
Right.
Everybody's out for something, and each one he wants to do the best he can for himself. And a lot of the assumption of the 2-player game is if I get $5, they took it away from you. And therefore, your strategy is simple. You want to avoid giving me the $5. But in an N-player game, a 5 strategy where I get $5, and you look at it, yeah, but you get it from him, not me. That's fine by me. Right? Whole different decision goes through, and they weren't doing very well in analyzing that with the pre-computer era.
Right. A lot more complicated problem.
Another thing that he pointed out was that the real world is not a zero-sum game. Many times it is. Either we own Wake Island or the Japanese do.
Right.
But in other cases, it's a case of which is easier, for me to go to war to take that oil well, or for me to go out and explore for oil. So that is another thing he said we don't do well on games theory strategy on, right? But it opened up concepts of things you could try to do in a game. Now, the Conflict and Defense guy's book, he liked the idea of conflict resolution through negotiation. And one of the things that he made a point of was that in conflict situations that he was looking at people actually trying to deal with. You have, for example, union and the company. Okay. If you have the union guys sit down and write down the 5 things they want to get, we want more pay.
Right.
We want better medical benefits. We want more vacation. We want safer working conditions, and we want families included in our insurance programs. Right. You go to the management, and what's the 5 things you want? Well, we want to reduce costs, right? And we want our guys to work longer hours and not complain when we have to do overtime to meet deadlines, and they come up with a list of stuff. His point was, it's not simply they want higher wages and you don't want to give them higher wages, which is classic newspaper view, right?
Right.
There's 5 things they want. There's 5 things you want to get. Now, you get an impartial soul who doesn't have any face to lose in this thing. He can sit down and can go through it and say, okay, you guys know of the 5 things you said you wanted, what's the one that really, really drives you? Is higher wages the only thing you'd want? If you had to give up on one thing, what would it be, right? And you go back to management, is there one thing you had to give up on, what would it be? Right? And it turns out that, if you'll include their families in the insurance program, and the insurance company tells the management, well, it's going to cost you X million dollars a year. And the workers say, but that's like really a key point for us. We want those families on that insurance.
Right.
Well, okay, let's see what we can do here. You get done negotiating, and the workers get better insurance rates, and they get more vacation every year, and you don't raise the pay. And they go away saying, hey, we got 3 out of 5. That wasn't bad. Right?
That's what happened my last union session, that exact thing.
So that's the kind of thing he's advocating, is the notion that I have many objectives in the world, not just one. And you have many, not just one. And we don't necessarily go head-to-head on every single one of those issues. And even if there's some degree of conflict, there's some stuff where you'd be happy to give me what I want if I will give you what thing you most want. And between us, we can work this out. And I looked at it and I said, boy, what a thought. Multiple player games where everybody has their own objectives, and they don't automatically conflict with everybody else, and they conflict in oddly interactive ways. That would be neat to try to do that. So that mulled that over for a long time. And then we'd had a number of games, increasingly sophisticated refereed war games. One of them I did was the Battle of Bladensburg. Now, Bladensburg is the battle that's fought between the invading British Army in 1814 and the American troops that are defending Washington. And after the Americans lose it, the British go in and burn Washington, D.C. That really happened, okay? One of the things I learned while reading a history about that is that something that greatly contributed to the Americans losing that battle is that nobody was in charge, or everybody was in charge. They had, on the battlefield, they had the President of the United States, the Vice President, the Secretary of War, the Commanding General of the U.S. Army, the head of the Ordnance Branch, a Navy Commodore, a general of Maryland militia, a general of District of Columbia militia, and no general of Virginia militia, but they had, was it Virginia? Okay, I think it's the Virginia militia general who's too sick to get there. He's coming, but he's got gout, and he's riding slowly. And he sends this lieutenant ahead of him with orders to get up there and straighten things out. And the lieutenant arrives, and with the authority of the general vested in his little 19-year-old body, he runs around countermanding everybody's orders. Every time he finds a Virginia unit, he tells it to go someplace else. And they're having enough trouble getting all of the cooks to coordinate as to what they're going to do. And at one point, the President of the United States starts across a bridge into the town of Bladensburg because he's going to ride up there and find the generals and have a meeting with them. And at the last second, the guys who are guarding the bridge stop him and point out that the British are holding the town. So it is a wonderfully chaotic situation. So I set that up and gamed it out one time where I had 14 people in the game. Some of them have a particular battalion that they're commanding, and it's here, there, or elsewhere on the board. And other people are officers, including Lieutenant Francis Scott Key, who's riding around handing out stupid instructions to everybody he runs into. He has the authority to tell any Virginia unit to go any place he wants to tell it to, and he has no rational plan. He's making it up as he goes along, right? And these guys, it's this mad scramble. And the British side, there's two guys, and they agreed on how to split their command, and each of them command a piece of the British forces, and they work nicely, and they win the battle, no shock, right? But we've done a battle like that, right, where everybody's pulling in different directions, and that was kind of fun. And so then we got down to the Braunstein game, where I got the guys together. We had a large number of people come over to my folks' house that night. And I said, this is my chance to try that everybody goes every which way game. So I briefed, as everybody came in, I started giving them briefings of what they were going to be doing. And I had a tabletop, 12 by 6 tabletop, all set up with the model houses and crepe paper roads and all the other beautiful terrain. And I had trays full of miniature soldiers all set up off to one side. And they had copies of the rules, and I had dice and all the usual paraphernalia laid out. And the first guy comes in, and I tell him, okay, you're this captain in the French Lancers, and Braunstein commands this important bridge over the Braunwasser River, and you've been sent out ahead of the army to find out what the defenses are like, right? So the rest of your Lancers will come on the board when you go back and get them. But you're here to make sure that your guys aren't riding into a trap. So you're going to go into the town in disguise and find out what's going on. Oh, that's cool. Okay, sure, right? And then I grab another guy and I tell him, okay, and you're the head of the Prussian Jaeger regiment that's been dispatched down here to reinforce Braunstein. And you're riding ahead, and you're going to arrive all by yourself, and the troops will be following shortly. Okay, so far it's in a meeting engagement. Advance guards are coming in, right? The next guy I grab is, you're the mayor of Braunstein. And last night there was a student riot in several of the taverns, and your Landwehr commander, who doubles as your chief of police, called out the guards and went in and broke heads and rounded up a whole bunch of students and threw them in jail. And this morning you have to talk to him. The tavern owners are all up in arms because they say he wrecked their taverns in the process. Him and his guys helped themselves with a lot of free beer after they, quote, saved the taverns. And they want money. And the Chancellor of the University wants to talk to you because he doesn't like the students getting beat up. And, now suddenly these people are getting non-military roles right and left, right? So we have a Chancellor, we have a Mayor, we have a Chief of Police, in effect. We have the Baron of Braunstein is going to be showing up shortly. He has things he's working on, nothing to do with anybody else. And we have a banker who's got a bank full of money. He's afraid it's going to get confiscated if the French invasion arrives, and so all these different civilian jobs. Now I had about 9 people planned for this.
So each one of them basically had several, not ethical dilemmas, but dilemmas that they had to deal with.
Right. They're usually not ethical dilemmas, but they are problems about trying to strike a balance between the conflicting interests, right? That made clear to the mayor that the tavern owners are real important to his repeated re-election, because they will give out lots of free drinks to his buddies on election days, right? It's made clear to him that he really likes the banker to be on his side because he's got the money. And at the same time, there's all these different people, right? And so they're going to be each strumming for their own thing. The tavern owners are going to try to extort all the money they can out of the mayor under the circumstances. And I set this up, and I had about 9 different roles that were thought out as to how they would interlock with each other and what they'd interfere with, and who'd be the sort of the likely allies and who wouldn't. Then, just to really stir the pot, I cast against type. Now, casting against type wasn't the term I had in mind. I'm more sophisticated now. But basically, I picked people out who ought to be cooperating with each other because they had mutual interests, but I took people who didn't much like each other for those roles.
Okay.
So the rabidly patriotic student A, who was the who was involved in the beginning of the riot between his backers and student B, the radical pro-French revolutionary student, right? Mm-hmm. Their fight had started over the stuff last night. Now, student A really ought to be chumming up with the forces of law and order, right? Well, he should be saying it's these radical red cap wearing revolutionaries that are responsible for all this, and try to get them hanged or kept in jail or whatever. But because he doesn't get along well with the guy who's playing the head of the Prussian Jaegers, right? They didn't hit it off well at all, and things developed along entirely different lines than they would have if they just said, well, it's going to obviously want to team up here, right? So, a lot of things happened. Now, that was the good side. The bad side for me was this. I got the game going, and I expected maybe 9 people, and like 22 people showed up.
Wow.
So I start making up new roles and just pulling on my left ear as fast as I can talk.
Can you just hit really quick? Well, one of the things that I was interested in is you said that originally you created the non-combatants as a joke.
Well, I figured we were going to do this once. The guys are going to play along with this, thinking everybody would get briefed. Well, until the troops you're going to be commanding get on the board, because it'll be a meeting engagement. Well, I want you to take care of this for me. It wasn't the first time that we had to come up with something like a cavalry patrol comes out and it's going to ask some local farmer where you can get across the river. And I'd grab one of the guys who didn't have a particular role in the game and it wasn't decided which side he was going to be on for the battle, and I'd say, they want to find out where the fords are in the river, and you're a local farmer. Now, it's up to you whether you cooperate with them or you mislead them. It's up to you. I just let you go do it, right? Mm-hmm. So everybody's kind of looking at it as that kind of thing, right? Oh, we'll be pushing lead around the table and shooting at each other pretty soon. And I figure we're going to run this thing until they all go, wait a minute, where the hell's the battle, right? And if they say, well, nothing happened in there, why don't we just, okay, I'd let the troops come on and I'd pull the plug on the complicated stuff because it was obviously a dud, right? Instead, I got it going. I had this insane idea that I could run the game by just sitting in a room off to one side where I had a map that I was working with. And I'd have the people come in, I'd show them the tabletop with all of the stuff, and I'd say, okay, you're where you're located, and move a little lead figure to show where they were, and I'd say, what are you planning to do next turn? And who are you talking to? And I'd send them out, and the next guy would come in and report to me, and I'd keep track of everything that's going on. This is not a practical way to run the game. But shortly, people start showing up out of turn and coming in. The thing that got me was when the Jaeger commander and student A came in and they said, we're going to fight a duel. How do we do it? I said, you're going to what? And it was like, yeah, so-and-so here. There's this, the student A, the champion, the head of the fencing team, has challenged the colonel to a duel. And I said, oh, gosh. Well, okay, here, you get to roll 2d6 and you get to roll 3d6. Why does he get to roll 3d6? I'm the head of the fencing club. And I said, yeah, only he's like a professional soldier and he's killed several people already. And you know what? He ran him through. And that was that. My student A was carried out on a slab. That was the end of him. I say you can't do worse than student A. So anyhow, suddenly I realized something's happening out there in the big room where we're supposed to just be sitting around schmoozing, and they're all madly interacting with each other. They're wheeling and dealing, conniving and scheming, and the plot is developing in ways I'd never thought of.
And they're not really paying attention.
And they're not telling me about it.
And they're not paying attention to the lead on the board anymore so much.
Yeah, well, they don't care that nothing's showing up for them to push around. They're busy doing their thing with each other, right? I mean, the university chancellor is busy sabotaging the old cannon that sits out in front of the university in case anybody tries to fire it off. And if that wasn't part of instructions, but there he is, he's doing it.
Right.
And there's just a million and one things. That's an interesting looking building we're going past. What in the world? Is somebody turned a barn into a church? Or, oh, I see. No, it's just an interesting window pattern. Okay. Well, anyhow, so they're going.
No, that's a cross.
It's a what?
That's a cross.
It really is a cross?
I think so.
It's hard to say. I don't see any signs on the building that make it clear.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our first station stop is Dyer, Indiana, in just a few minutes. Our time out of Dyer is 6:58 Central Time, and the time now is 6:43. So we have plenty of dwell time if you'd like to exit the train to stretch.
Jump off, take a
running circles. Yep. If you're going to do so, please use the handrails when you exit, and exit only where you see a uniformed Amtrak employee. Please do not wander from train side so that you do not hear the all-aboard call from the conductor, so will sadly be waving at you from the rear of the train as we depart Dyer.
He's fun.
6:58 departure, Dyer is next.
We were traveling across the country many years ago. We're up in North Dakota and there's a blizzard going on outside and we're in an Amtrak train. And this guy comes on and he says, "Hello, this is Stewie. I'm your lounge car attendant. And I want to announce the opening of the new swimming pool on the 3rd floor of our lounge car. Anyone reporting up to the lounge car in beach attire will be given a free drink."
Yeah.
And so people go walking past us in swimming suits after a little while, all headed up the aisle, right? And they had this little party going on up in the lounge car. He's giving out free drinks to all the people in swimming suits. It was fun, right? What a unstuffy attitude, right? He was a lot of fun. But back to this. So here I am, and I realized that I've totally lost control. That all of my intricate plans about how I was going to score everybody have gone down the drain. And besides which, I've now created like an extra 13 characters that I never thought about before the game, and I don't know how they interact and what it's going to do to the balance of the game and everything else. And finally, it's about 2 o'clock in the morning. I called everybody and I said, okay. I said, I was going to have you there. I was going to tell you who won the game. But I have to say, I'm sorry, this got completely out of hand. I have no idea who won the game. And everybody's saying, "Oh, that's okay. We had a great time." And I was saying, "Oh gosh, that's nice of them." You know, that's decent of them. And now I was off. By that point, I had started in graduate school, and I was just home on holidays, right? So I went off to school. The next coming back, they said, "When are you going to do the Brownstein game?" And I said, "Well, you guys didn't." "Yeah, we thought it was great. Everybody wants to know one." I said, "Well, okay." So then I went back to college, and I had months before the next holiday, and I thought about it, and I came back, and I had planned it all up. I knew exactly what I had to do. I wasn't going to get out of control next time back. I was going to absolutely control everything I did. Nobody was going to breathe without getting my approval, and we were going to make that game work right so I could figure out who won. Unfortunately, I only tried it out on 4 people, so they didn't tell everybody how rotten it was. And I tried to dust it off and pretty it up a little more again on some people who were very patient and tried to play it with me, and it was just terrible.
Is it because at this time you're still seeing it as a war game?
Well, it's because I'm seeing it as an exercise in being able to score the performances and having it got you only do exact specific things for which I know what the score is. And your choices of what you can do are no longer kind of whatever comes into your head. It's you got A, B, or C, right? And then I get to go where I evaluate them against each other and roll some dice and work out how many points I got. Right? And it was really slow, and people just couldn't get into the swing of it. They didn't like it, and I didn't like it, and it was a dud. So I went off and I said, that has really not worked. What am I doing wrong? And then it hit me. The key thing was to let them do what they wanted to do, never mind who wins. And it took me a while before I realized that there's a slogan that applies to that I didn't appreciate then, and which is usually said to mean something else, but it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game.
Right.
Or maybe I should say it's not whether you win or lose, it's that you play the game. But in any case, that everybody enjoyed the playing. And it wasn't the winning or losing was not the powerful thing. I mean, there are some people who are really, once again, ruthlessly motivated to show people up, right? You definitely took pleasure in the fact that they managed to really ace that guy who was playing a banker because they don't particularly like him or whatever.
Right.
But most people would just be in there and they'd be playing for the sake of playing, and they get involved and they enjoy it. Now, to leap forward in history a while, think about all the Dungeons and Dragons adventures I've ever had explained to you or told to you with enthusiasm, right? So, we cast the teleport spell on the thief, and we elevated him up the side of the tower so he could look in the window we couldn't climb up to. And he checked in there, and darn it, if it wasn't a black dragon in there, it just fried him, right? And when he fell back down, the dragon comes out, and he plunges down and hits us, yeah?
Do you know, I thought my husband could talk a lot, but you have out-talked my husband.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, ma'am.
You have talked non-stop for an hour. And I thought he could talk a lot, but you have beat him.
Well, is it really bothering you? We could move.
No.
Okay.
I'm up there, but I have heard every word you have said. And I told him, I said, Nick, I thought you could talk a lot. But I said, I found a man that can out-talk you. I'll have to tell the kids.
Well, if he needs help, just hand him a microphone and tell him he's being interviewed.
Whew. Non-stop.
Like I said, you're going to have to edit this.
How in the world can you talk without taking a breath?
Well, I've been lecturing for years.
Well, I'm an RN and I used to, but I didn't take a breath.
Well, I guess I offered to me and she didn't say yes, so we'll just carry on.
Yeah. We'll take that out, I mean, probably.
Yeah, but there you go. You know, it's kind of trying to give you what you asked for here. Anyhow, so that was the point when you heard these D&D games where they tell you all about how the whole party got wiped out, right?
Right.
And they had a great time. They lost. They got killed. Whatever. Only 2 of them survived. Whatever happened, right? It was the biggest thinking disaster they've had in years of gaming, and by golly, it was so cool the way it worked out. But we all got killed. Whatever, And you say to yourself, it's not winning and losing. It's driving these guys.
Right.
So I didn't perceive all of it, but I perceived that you had to give them their heads and let them run with it.
Okay.
So the next time I set up a game, it was more structured than the first Brownstein. I had a better idea of what all the characters were and what their capabilities were. And it actually had some more combat stuff in it. You're struggling for control in this coup d'etat in this Latin American country, mythical Latin American country. Or rather, the situation is ripe for there to be a coup d'etat. There doesn't necessarily have to be one. The people who would potentially carry it out may or may not decide to go try it out for size. Mm-hmm. And we ran that, and they did. And then it came to blows, and there were tanks cruising up and down the street, getting shot at by armored cars and stuff like that. But it wasn't guaranteed that it was going to happen that way. The sides decided to pick up the way they were going to do things. Each guy decided what he was going to do, and that happened. And in that game, however, there were a lot of people who didn't have any military units under their control, whose purpose in life was to hand out propaganda leaflets or whatever. Mm-hmm. And the ultimate victor of the whole game, and that's been written up in things on the internet, was Dave Arneson, who was one of the players.
Right.
And who caps besides convincing the Minister of the Treasury to give him $1 million American dollars out of the vaults of the Treasury, and gets a free helicopter right out of the country with his ill-gotten gains, rubs salt in the wounds by throwing his leaflets out of the helicopters that flies over the city, so they're scattered all over town. Right? It was just, everybody agreed that whatever the scoring system I thought I was using was, that he definitely walked off of the game, right? Other people wound up running the country, but by golly, he got away with lots of money. So now that was very much a watershed in terms of role-playing games. Right? So now I've given you all that historical background on where we led up to it, and how we got there, and probably one question has now been answered, correct?
Actually, no, you covered a lot of the points that I was going to ask.
Okay.
Okay, let's move on then to talking about self-publishing then.
Oh, well, that's interesting.
That's something that you didn't do with Brownstein, but you did with Strategos N.
Right, and with bombers and battleships that nobody's ever seen.
And then the second Valley Forge.
right, and then Source of the Nile. Well, first off, in the 1960s, it was virtually all there was self-publishing. We didn't appreciate in those days that the Avalon Hill Company, that we thought was this gigantic publishing empire, right, consisted of, I think, 4 people who had really gone in over their head on trying to break into the game publishing business in competition with the established Parker Brothers and the rest of those.
Gotcha.
And who, in fact, in 1963, about the time of graduating from high school, they go bankrupt. And they're taken over by their principal creditor, who sees a real possibility in what these poor guys have tried to start up as a future activity, even though they're losing money at the time.
Right.
With having sunk all their money into games and not being able to get the games to stay out on the shelves on the typical toy store outlets that they had to reach, right? And he was the printer that they owed more money to than anybody else. So he went around to the other 13 companies they couldn't pay and took over their debts from these other guys, paid them off, and he kept them on as a captive account for his printing company. So yeah, they're losing money, technically, but it's coming into my left pocket instead of my right pocket. So it's not as bad as it seems. And we will print their games when we have a hole in our printing schedule, and we didn't have anything else to do that week anyhow. And, you know, so he gets to run the company as the lowest possible loss, with a staff of just a couple of people who keep selling games by mail. And, you know, it just cuts it way back, but he keeps it alive. And so from 1963 to 68 or thereabouts, the Avalon Hill Company that we all think is this giant publishing enterprise, and we sending in handwritten manuscripts of games we think they love to publish.
Right.
Right? And they're all saying, thank you very much, but we already have a game about the hunt for the Bismarck, or whatever, right? These guys are hardly better than we are, except that they blew a whole lot more of their money. Right? I mean, they were grown-up people who could mortgage their house in order to lose it on running a company, kind of a thing. Right?
That's kind of the story of...
Oh yeah, so many of the game companies have lived and died. Now, during that period, SPI gets started by a bunch of gamers who are willing to sleep on the floor and pay themselves nothing in order to publish their games.
Right.
And again, we're out in the sticks, and we think they're another real company with like corporate offices and limousines.
Right.
You know, everything is self-published to all practical purposes at that time. There's
so it was less of an ethic and more of a just not having any choice.
Yeah, you know, there is no real game industry. We could go to Parker Brothers and Milton Bradley and say, here, I've got this really cool game about the Battle of Dien Bien Phu or whatever.
And they would
they'd go, yeah, right. Mom's going to buy that for her nephew for Christmas, right? Whatever. Right. And there were 1 or 2 people who succeeded by some means or other in convincing the big game companies that this war game thing that was kind of gathering a little steam over in a corner might be worth going into, because there were big companies who did publish war kind of strategy games that came out during that period. There was something called Summit, and there was another one called Conflict, and there had been games from during World War II. The big game companies had published some not very sophisticated war games that you can barely find hidden away somewhere in a junk store somewhere nowadays.
Right.
So there are a few of these, you know, there have been ventures in that direction from established publishers, but they were very rare. For the most part, they could make a lot more money by knocking off another game for the 6 to 12-year-old crowd than for family games playing things. And not all of the games they were making were despicable. I mean, Careers was a cool game in which you had variable objectives for the different players. And I thought that was neat. And Clue was a good game. There were certainly good games.
For a freight train, we'll have to hang out in the siding for a few minutes. Not sure exactly how long that delay will be, but we do appreciate your patience. And Rensselaer will be next once we get rolling again. Probably about an hour after we get rolling.
But in the 1960s, the Xerox machine, if it's been invented, none of us can see one. And if you produce anything in bulk, you use a mimeograph machine. which is a clunky predecessor to it, in which you have to type up these very messy transfer masters that you then run through a special ink.
The wheel, right?
You turn a crank and they come out one at a time, all purple and blurry. Okay?
Gotcha.
Okay, so that was the state of the art in the mid '60s, and I came up with a set of rules for World War II air naval combat that I called bombers and battleships, and I hand produced that in a gigantic run of maybe 24 copies, maybe even 100 copies. I don't remember now, but it was very small. With the assistance of Dave Arneson, who had access to a mimeograph machine. And we sold a handful of copies, and mostly we just gave them away to guys in the group to play battles with, right? We had been using one of the really pioneering commercially available sets of rules, Fletcher Pratt's Naval War Game, which he published in 1940, and which was just barely available because when Fletcher Pratt died, he was a very successful author, and any attempts to reprint his Naval War Game, which
would have got you sued.
Well, not only us sued, but anybody who seriously thought of trying to bring it back out and print it again, make another printing of it, and pay royalties and all that, would be told by his estate that they expected the kind of royalties that Mr. Pratt's other works commanded, which were like serious money, right? And so you could find a handful of surviving copies from back then, but that was about it. And indeed, I think there were some like knockoffs floating around, right? But they were pretty rare because you couldn't Xerox, and nobody was going to go stick his neck out so far as to like set up an offset print run of the things that would attract attention. So you saw somebody would type the whole thing out on mimeograph masters. Boy, there's tedious work for you. And it was certainly not nicking into his estate's revenues at all. Now, in the years since then, it finally came around to where somebody did finally reissue them, and you can buy them nowadays. And they are extremely sophisticated, given, again, he's pioneering in a total vacuum. Modeling of battleship and cruiser and destroyer, gun-to-gun kind of combat. He did it late 1930s. And they used Naval War Games Group used these to fight, significant battles. In which I understand he had this kid named Isaac Asimov as one of his gamers, and another one was L. Sprague de Camp, and he had a bunch of people, including retired Navy officers and stuff, were playing his battles, and they were pretty well done. And also, not available to us at the time, the U.S. Navy War College had been doing battles since the turn of the century, and they had rules, but they weren't just handing them out to people. So there were things going on out there. Well, we got the Pratt ones, and we were really impressed. This was a good system. There was no argument about what the rules said, and not much fiddling with them. We just went ahead and did it the way it said. But there was no reasonable reason using airplanes. I mean, he basically did World War I with World War II ships. He had thrown in the last little bit about, you can have the airplane models and you put them on stands and people have to estimate the range of the airplane you shoot it down. But it was really not very good modeling of how airplanes operated with ships. So I set up my own set of rules for air-to-air combat and for airplanes, dive bombing, or torpedo bombing ships. Okay, so I published that. And then that was my first crack at it, and it was like a real small cash outlay. I was a student a grad student at the time. And then the next time around, Strategos was I had sat down with the Napoleonic war games that we've been playing. And actually, I'd done this before bombers and battleships, but I had taken Strategos, and I tried to strip those 340 pages down to just the essential tables and basically the things we'd done, and to try to backdate the weapons into 1800 instead of 1880, and which I was not very good at doing, but I tried. And I turned those out, and we used them for gaming within our group in the Twin Cities for Arneson's giant Napoleonic campaign and stuff, along with enormous masses of information that Arneson dug up to the strategic level, like how much did the battleship cost and things, right? And those were our tactical rules for fighting the battles. And we used them a lot, and eventually, I ran off a set, the same deal. It was like I went to a local job shop and had them offset print like 100 copies, which was about as much as I could afford to pay, and it's lousy economies of scale there, right?
Right.
They probably were $5 a piece for the rather small set of, 20 pages or whatever inch you want. But we needed them for use in the group, so I did those, and we sold a few to other people who hear about them and want to get a copy, and we'd mail them to them.
Right.
Again, it's not a money-making activity for me, so it's self-publishing, very much vanity press kind of thing, or at least we're just doing it for your own use. Later on, once Dave Arneson had a company going of his own, this is now jumping ahead 10 years, right, post-TSR, he did a reprint on it with all the assets and much more modern stuff and a lot more money and a bigger run of them. And those are kicking around with people with nice illustrations and things. The third thing, the Valley Forge 2. Now I've gone off to the Army and I've come back from the Army, and TSR has been born and is running along, and people are talking to me and Gary about, you ought to take Wesley's Napoleonic Wars and print those and sell those. And Gary has an inspiration. He says, no, what we'll do instead, next year is 1976, and it's the same bicentennial, and everybody's going to want us to do American Revolutionary War battles. So what you got to do is rewrite them as American Revolutionary War rules. So I said, darn, that'll be fun. So I rewrite the whole thing. Give him a 150-page manuscript called The Redcoats Are Coming. He is a bit flabbergasted at my having covered every imaginable thing about how to do siege warfare and build fortresses, and I've just gone nuts on this thing. Then he takes it off my hands and he says, I think we ought to call the new game Valley Forge. That'd be a great name. And I said, I don't know, Gary, Valley Forge isn't even a battle. We don't fight a battle there, You're going to do a game like Valley Forge, it sort of implies that you're going to have this wonderful game where you get to see how many toes you freeze off. It's not going to be fun at all. But he said, oh, but Valley Forge is so cool. And I said, yeah, I really got to come up with something else. So we're fine. So that's that. And we carry on. Now, I'm back in the Army by this point. So I'm sort of intermittently available to talk to him. And as we approach the magic date for Gen Con in 1976, when I was going to release this thing, I get one last... I won't go through the enormous trouble I went through just trying to get a contract negotiated and signed. That touches on a long, sad story about the Byzantine struggle for power in the TSR and how my contract became one of the pawns in that game between Gary and other people who kept blocking getting things done. But ultimately, we got it signed. We got the thing going to be published. And I get a last-minute call from Gary. He says, oh, we found it. We can't call it Redcoats. Are coming to somebody else calling the game the Redcoats. And it did confuse things. So we're going to call it Valley Forge. Okay. And he brings it out with his glorious full-color cover of Washington reviewing the troops. Doesn't have much to do with Valley Forge, and there's even less to do with it when you find out it's the painting of President Washington reviewing the troops of the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. But it looked cool and it wasn't in public domain. And you know you have to have a color cover to sell the thing.
Yeah.
So we brought the thing out, but among other blunders, they cut down 150 pages to like 18 pages. And they lost page 9. Between typesetting and printing. So there's an abrupt change of subject at the bottom of the page that isn't renewed, and you don't find out the first half page of cavalry never appears, or the last half page of artillery, or whatever it was, right? It was like, they really messed up bad. At the time, I thought it was just screaming incompetence on the part of the guys who put it together. Later, I came to see that against the general backdrop of destruction and subversion of Gary and his projects by people in the company at that moment, and recognized that I had been targeted as yet another person to drive away from Gary by screaming.
Okay.
So it was too bad. I was fortunate in that because I didn't live and work at PSR like most of the other guys associated with it did. I was really a small fish in the purges, and I didn't really care a lot. I was off being an Army officer at the time, right? I was just annoyed to no end, but it wasn't like it crushed me or deprived me of a job or something.
Right.
Anyhow, so that went down. So I came back to him and I said, well, the original plan, and he said we're going to have to shorten it for publication, was you're going to do it 3 volumes, just like you did the 3 volumes of Dungeons and Dragons and other things. So when are we going to do the second volume and put it in a errata for all mistakes you made on the first one? And the answer was, we decided it's not selling, so we're not going to do it. And I had to agree that the bicentennial was a commercial disaster. Mm-hmm. Nothing I brought up for the bicentennial was a success. Avalon Hill 1776 game that came out like 2 years before the bicentennial was moderately successful, but everything else just sunk like a rock. And so I couldn't complain that it was their idiocy that caused it. But I felt that I wanted vindication, so I then self-published Valley Forge 2, so as to bring out a 26-page errata for an 18-page set of rules. And Valley Forge 2, well, that was funny too. At this point, there were major firings going on at PSR. And one of the guys who got removed was, actually, he quit before they got around to firing him. You could see the handwriting on the wall. So David McGarry, who had done a bunch of this kind of work for PSR, was available. I was off being an Army officer, and I talked to McGarry, and McGarry said, you can give me, the money, and I can get the thing printed. I know how to do it. I know people who do printing. I know a layout, artist, and all that. Fine. So I gave him $1,000 that I figured I could afford to lose on my vanity publishing here.
Right.
And he was going to run off however many copies he could get. Well, he called me a few weeks before 1977 Gen Con and said, well, Dave, it works out like this. The costs have been higher than I thought they were. And we're only going to be able to get you, let me think if I can get the numbers right now. We're only going to be able to get you 300 copies, which would mean that in effect it cost you $3.33 a piece. And I said, well, I suppose I was going to sell them for like $5. He said, yeah, but remember, if you're going to discount your store, you got to give 40% off. Oh, yeah, I'd lose money on every copy. I said, right, but if you give me another $600, I can get 1,000 copies. Then there'll only be about 60 of these, and I can discount them in a regular way and, still show some profit on each one. And I thought, that sounds good, you can buy the dozen, so I went there. He was perfectly honest with me about the numbers. He didn't line his pocket or anything. I'm not saying that. He just gave me advice. The thing that I didn't understand then, but it was an important lesson, was I should have asked, and what will it cost me if we sell those babies out like hotcakes, and I want another 1,000 copies next month? And the answer would have been, well, gee, I guess another $650. In other words, there's almost no downside to my not buying any more copies right now.
Right.
Because all the setup costs for a small print will like that, $50 or something. Right? So instead of getting 1,600 copies and hoping it'll all sell, I could have got 300 copies and found out if they're going to sell at all. I got 1,600 copies. In the first couple of months, I sold a whole lot of them to all the people who had a Valley Forge and wanted to get it straightened out. And then they stopped selling. And my total sales were just about 300 copies. Now that includes ones that I discounted. But in the end, I could have finished off losing like $100 on the deal instead of losing like, $1,500 on the deal.
And eventually had to mulch them, right?
Oh yeah, well actually what I actually did is I'd given them to a distributor to see if he could find anybody who'd take them. And he saw me at like Origins, and he said, Dave, I still got all those boxes. And he said, Herb, you can do whatever you want to with them. You don't have to pay me a dime. You can just use them for anything you want.
To get them off your tax.
And that was, right, so he could basically take them out of the warehouse. He could turn them into sawdust, and he could write off take a tax or whatever he was going to do with them, right? I said, that's fine, Herb. I dropped them off on you on the way to Origins. I went from Origins one year, And like a year later, he's hardly moved any of them. But that's fine. They're turkeys.
Yeah.
So I've got 6 copies I shoved on a shelf at home. That's the world supply. Well, not the world supply, because there's 300 copies out there somewhere, right?
Right.
So that was a disaster in a way, but it was a learning curve, and it only cost me $1,600, and I got some of the money back. So, and I learned a couple other things out of it too. That was good, because I learned, for one thing, I didn't know what the discount structures were.
Yeah, I've covered that before.
I had no idea what you paid for discounts, and that taught me a bunch of those things. It taught me a lot about how things get accomplished. And so the next time it was time to do a game, Ross and I did Source of the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
Those lessons all came back, and we had a much better idea of how the world was going to operate and how we were going to business, and what we were risking, and what we were willing to risk, and how much work it was going to be in. And that worked out. You can interview him all about that.
Okay.
The other thing I would say is that we got to a point, I did the Brownstein games, and we did a few of them, and then I went off to the Army.
Right.
And Arneson said to me, is it okay if I run Brownstein games while you're gone? I said, Dave, I don't own it. Have fun. It's set up in your dad's basement anyhow.
Right.
And at the time, I figured I'm going in the Army. There's a war on in Vietnam. I'm going to go over there and die. So I'm really not too worried about the future ownership of Brownstein.
Yeah.
The whole role-playing game thing that's going to happen, I'm not looking down the road towards that. So I said, fine, and I left. And when I got back and I was still all in one piece, they had by that point gone on and started playing Blackmore.
Right.
And there's an obvious sort of takeoff there, Brownstein and Blackmore, right? So, is that you or somebody else who has that right there?
I don't know.
So anyhow, that brings you up to there. Now, person who was here for the transition from back when we were doing the Napoleonic games through the first Brownstein, he was in it, and so on, is Ross. And he can probably fill you in great on all the things that happened thereafter.
What time are we at?
Time are we at? I
Should
don't
be
know.
at the top
you,
there.
You want it. You can read it.
So we're at 1:20.
Right.
So let me get
Couple more particular questions.
a couple more
Okay.
things. Because I'd rather be prepared to talk to someone than completely unprepared like I am right now.
Okay.
Let's talk about the invention of polyhedral dice.
Okay.
That's something that you've been credited with.
Yes, and I am sort of the inventor of polyhedral dice. And I think it's, aside from the fact that a six-sided dice is a polyhedron, and people have been using it for centuries, and therefore somebody invented at least one of them, right?
But
okay,
D4,
what happened?
D8.
What happened was that when I was in high school, we had a geometry class, and they had these little plastic solids with numbers on the face to show us what the 5 regular polyhedra invented by the ancient Greeks were, right? A couple of years go by. I'm wargaming. I have the Totten rules. And he has a table. A lot of tables in the rolling 6-sided dice, 3 6-sided dice, subtract the largest one and multiply by the smallest one. Junk like that to come up with distributions, right?
Right.
Actually, it wasn't that sophisticated, but he's got rolling 2d6 or rolling 1d6, and then the table of looking things up, and they were rolling a 6d6 thing for one thing, right?
Okay.
So he's got those. And then he has one table that uses a 12-sided teetotum instead. And typically in his rules, if you work out some attack and it turns out the odds are 7-3 in your favor, you have a problem. If the odds were 4-2 in your favor, you'd roll a 6-sided die, 1, 2, 3, 4, you win, 5, 6, I win. Okay? But if it's 7-3, that doesn't add up to 6. So we had several convoluted ways of solving that. But one of the things he has is this table. He says you get a 12-sided teetotum, and then 1 through 7, you win, and 8, 9, 10, I win, and 11 and 12, we do it again, right? Mm-hmm. Oh, cool, right? And I said, that's great. What the hell's a 12-sided teetotum?
Yeah,
and
that's
then,
what I was thinking.
And then
too.
I said, it's that 12-sided Gesonenplatzer they showed me in geometry class, right? Yeah. The one with the cool looking pentagonal faces on it. The what's a hoochie, whatever it was. So I run back and I find a catalog from Edmund Scientific Company in Chicago. They sell stuff for schools.
Okay.
And I looked through it, and sure enough, there is set of 5 geometric solids, and I say, that's how I can get one of those things. But you got to buy 5 of them, and they're $6 a set. And gasoline in those days is 20 cents a gallon.
Right.
So I'm in effect, by modern standards, I'm buying a $60 to $100 set of
Dice.
6 dice, 5 dice to get the one I want.
Right.
Well, I was okay. I popped my $6 to get the one set, and I took it over and I said, guys, look at this. I got a 12-sided teetotum we can use now, and table J or whatever it is that uses it in the rules. I can use that one. And he goes, what are the rest of those? And I said, well, they're polyhedra, and there's a little piece of paper that says this one's an icosahedron, and that's a, So, and people start rolling them across the table and going, like, this is way cool. Look at this 4-sided one. Boy, that's really strange, right?
Yeah.
So people would play around with them idly while I was using the D12. And I was also using the D10 because it hit me pretty quick. Well, that's a cool number too, right? You can generate numbers from 1 to 10. You could roll it 3 times to generate a 3-digit decimal probability. And it's easy to compute things, come up with 34% success rate or a 39% success rate, and you roll it twice, there's 30, and there's 7. Not too low, right? Or whatever.
Right.
A little bit more time. One of the guys in the group had a real job and was making good money, so he could pop $6 a whack. So he bought several more sets and brought them in. And then we took the D20s, because there are no D10s in the set, of course, they're D20s.
Right.
And they're all pre-inked. That's the way they came, right? Our numbers are already inked. So you proceeded to like white out the leading digits. So now instead of being numbered from 1 through 20, they're numbered 1 through 9, and then 1 through 9, and then 0, and then 1 through 9 and 0 again, and you now have a double 10-sided dice.
Right.
And if you ink them in red and white and blue, you can roll them, and there's an obvious sequence you read them in, which a lot of the guys in the game could never remember.
Red, white, and blue?
Yeah. I was really astonished to find that people couldn't keep it straight in their heads.
Right.
That you read them in the order red, white, blue. Oh, gosh. Anyhow, but you can generate 3-digit numbers of 1 cast of the dice, and isn't this cool, right? So we're using for that. And then I go off to the Army, and I come back, and they're playing Dungeons and Dragons. Well, the predecessor of Dungeons and Dragons, Blackmore. And they are using all the wacky shaped dice that are laying around that are excess from the sets I was really into, that I really found useful. And when they migrate on at the beginnings of Dungeons and Dragons, and they're talking about they're going to do this game, they're going to actually go commercial with this thing, right? And I said, well, don't use the polyhedral dice. I mean, a guy's going to spend $10 to get your game, and he's going to have to go out and spend another $6 to buy the wacky dice.
Right.
It's never going to work that way. Well, of course, they didn't listen to me, and as a result, the game was a disaster.
Yeah.
But so all this is happening, right? And I've come up with this thing, and at the time, I thought, hey, the ancient Greeks invented it. Right? They came up with these shapes. And obviously Totten must have been using one of them in his games, and everybody uses a 6 already.
Right.
So what's that? I'm not running out putting in a copyright for that because everybody already knows it, right? Years go by, and I began to find out that, well, no, it's not all that screamingly obvious. The idea of using them for dice instead of just being mathematical abstractions, the Greeks weren't throwing them to play games with.
Right.
And then in about 1992 or somewhere in there, I came across a reproduction of a real English game published in 1828, and it was a 12-sided teetotum in it, and it isn't a D12. You know what a dreidel is?
The play toy for Jewish kids?
Right. It's a little 4-sided top.
Okay.
Okay, you can get numbers 1 through 3, 1, 2, 3, or 4, or maybe it's Alpha, Beth, Gimel, something, whatever. Whatever. You spin it and you get 1 of 4 things, right?
Right.
Okay. Now make it with 12 faces around the outside.
Okay.
And you have a 12-sided teetotum.
And you can spin it.
Yeah, you spin it on its point, and it flops over, and one side is up. That's the number you've spun. Right?
Gotcha.
So I've got this really nice little imitation, what would have probably been ivory in the original expensive game in 1828, or maybe it was carved bone, but something, right? And I'm sure it's made out of plastic in mine. But it's a really nice looking little thing, right? And I paid like $100 to get the darn reproduction game just to get that. It's a 12-sided teetotum. I finally have one. Right? But so that's the point. I suddenly realized, well, dummy, then Totten didn't know about it, and the Greeks didn't know about it, and all the people you figured got the idea before you didn't. So now the question is, so who did? Well, I have seen a book that says that the Japanese were using two 20-sided dice numbered from 0 to 9 twice in 3 different colors to generate 3-digit probability numbers.
Right.
But I've seen that book, and it's copyrighted like in 1977. I've never been able to find an earlier edition of the book that goes back to before I started doing this to see whether they learned it by reading Dungeons and Dragons or not.
Gotcha.
Somebody in 1965, right when I was doing this, applied for a patent on using them as dice. And as patent photographs, you can find these on the internet. Patent photograph shows the same set of 5 dice that I was using. I knew the guy's name, never met him. Can't believe that he just, Dungeons and Dragons has not been published yet, right? Can't believe that he got the idea from me. So somebody else was out there inventing this, quote that March on. So I would say that I was one of the inventors, as other people were coming up at the same time, the same way that we all remember Edison invented the light bulb, but he really didn't.
Right. There were also other people.
There were people when he was a small child who were making light bulbs. It's just that their light bulbs didn't last very long, didn't cast very bright light. Yeah. He just made one that was commercially successful, as opposed to all the other guys who had ineffective ones.
Right.
So, I came up with the idea, and from my introducing it in our group, it spread into Dungeons and Dragons, and virtually everybody who's doing it got it by that pathway. But that doesn't mean somebody else didn't also do it without me. And the same thing can be said about the role-playing games. I keep saying role-playing games, and internally I keep saying myself, and I hate that term, but we're stuck with it. It's the one we've all adopted. Yeah. Because there was a Michael J. Corns came up with a set of World War II single-figure combat rules called Modern War Miniatures, which tried to come up with all the statistical data on all the different World War II weapons. Okay. And he has a section at the back of the book where, beyond just tables and tables and tables of armor penetration and rates of fire and everything, he has a little section at the back that describes playing the game. And he has a referee, and he has individual players. And the referee says, okay, what are you going to do now? And the player says, I'm going to run across the street towards the open doorway. And the referee says, okay, you're halfway across the street. And you hear a machine gun firing. What do? I keep running faster, right? Okay, too bad. You got hit. You're down. You're laying in the street in front of the door. What are you going to do now? I'm going to try to crawl in the door. I hit you again. You're dead. Now, what's he doing? Well, it sure sounds kind of like a referee role-playing kind of game, right? The way that he's talking about running it, referee and player. Mm-hmm. Sorry, probably really came as a bit thud there.
It'll be okay.
And so, obviously, Corns was creating something, and I never met him, and he never met me, and it's doing this in parallel with my doing Brownstein games at the same time frame. So I'm having ideas, and he's having ideas, each one of which are early kind of role-playing games. Now, and a refereed aspect of it is pretty important.
His was about 2 years later, though, right?
What?
His was about 2 years later.
His appears to have come out. I don't believe there's any way on earth that he heard anything about the people up in Minneapolis.
No, that's not what I'm saying. But
yeah, his came out about 2 years after the first thing that I did, but close enough.
Because you weren't publishing.
I wasn't publishing. So I think it's highly unlikely that he met some guy who had been up on vacation and played in one of our games in the Twin Cities.
Well enough for him to get it all
like
figured
that,
out.
Right. I think he just evolved the concept on his own. And And it's cool that he did. And he did not go on in the games business at all either. So it's as though you went back and you found out that somebody had built a perfectly good flying airplane in 1895, but he was really interested in being a ship captain. He never bothered to do anything with it. You know?
That happens a lot with people who invent things. So
yeah, there's a lot of. I mean, there was a lot of nationalistic argument in the early 20th century about whether indeed the Wright brothers had invented the airplane for the same kind of reasons. I mean, okay, they built an airplane to fly 120 feet. There were other people who could claim, well, darn, I had an airplane that did that good about the same time. And it really goes back to George Cayley, who did all this theoretical research on how to get lift out of wings and things. Mm-hmm. And he built an airplane that never flew, but his descendants in the 20th century rebuilt the airplane according to his plans. And by putting in a modern engine with vastly better horsepower to weight ratio, they got it to fly. Claiming, therefore, that he probably did get his to fly when nobody's looking.
Right.
And where do you go for that, right? But there was Santos Dumont, who was building flying craft of various kinds at the same time too. What really clinched it was in 1909, 6 years after the famous first flight in North Carolina. There was an international airplane show in Paris. And all the European inventors who were making things that would barely get off the ground were going to all show up there and show them off to each other. And the Wright brothers from America came over and they uncrated their current version of the Wright Flyer and they set it up. And they took off and they went out, they flew over the city back and forth, making big circles in the sky and kept flying and flying and flying. And everybody else on the ground is going, I haven't been able to figure out how to make turns with mine yet. And by that point, it was, well, I don't care if we did ours for 4 years, but it's obviously the only one that works.
Right.
So, it's all of us, these parallel inventors, all the people who invented automobiles and all the complications that Henry Ford went through on lawsuits, and the people who invented submarines, and there's all these ideas that people get and they work on, and sometimes centuries go by. Right? And the idea is brought back, and it works better the next time around for different reasons. So, no, there are things that are invented in whole cloth, nobody did anything like it beforehand, but an awful lot of things are the case if you finally got it to work right.
Yeah.
There's another parallel I like to make, too, kind of thinking. Who invented the telegraph? Most people think it's Samuel Morse who invented the telegraph. He didn't, actually. The telegraph was invented by Professor Henry, who made the magnetic telegraph, and he proceeded to demonstrate that you can send signals with it up to a distance of at least a mile by wrapping a mile of wire around and around and around the laboratory he was in, and showing you could close the switch here and you make the signals come off over here, and a long length of wire would still work, right?
Right.
So he did all this stuff. He showed you could send signals. He did all these things, and he did it as an exercise because he's a physics professor. And that was fine, and he went back to working on other stuff. A few years later, Morse comes along and he starts the American Telegraph Company. He's gonna revolutionize communications by having telegraph stations that will send messages faster than you can send them by waving flags or night and day and all this, right? And he gets going on it. People say, who invented it? Well, I invented this all on my own. I had this incredible idea. I was on a transatlantic ocean voyage, and I came ashore and I said, I've got to build this. Right? Oh, gee, it sure looks a lot like what Professor Henry's doing. I've never heard of the Henry guy. Not me. No, sir. Right? All right. His company is at death's door. He's got a big problem. They have all these insulated wires they're burying in the ground and carry the signals out. And the insulation isn't up to it. And they can't keep the thing working for more than a few days at a time.
Right.
It's costing a fortune to put it in. Finally, he goes to Professor Henry and he says, okay, we've got a problem I can't fix. They say that you did yours over a distance of a mile and it worked okay. How did you do it? And Henry says, well, I didn't bury the wires in the ground. I hung them between poles on glass insulators. All the money I'm going to save just putting up poles. Holy mackerel, what an idea, right? And Morse says, all right, you got me. I'm going to have to cut you in on it then. What do you want? And Henry says, I don't want anything. I'm a scientist. They pay me to be a scientist. When I develop things, they've already paid me for them. They're free for everybody. And Morse is just flabbergasted that the schmuck doesn't want to hold him up for any money. So he goes off and says he invented the telegraph, and that's that. And so here I am. I gave my gift to the world, right? This was it. Never mind. I don't get no credit, or I don't get any money for it. There you go. But that was the thing with the dice. So you got any other questions for me?
I think that's where I'd like to leave it.
You were listening to Theory from the Closet. This show is copyleft via the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 3.0 license, which means you can bend, fold, spindle, and mutilate, but you've got to keep it free so that others can use your stuff, and you got to give me credit for what's mine. That's really it. You shouldn't be listening anymore.